Hello everyone, Alec Elger the SideQuest Gamer here, and if you've seen some of my past videos like my top 10 best Metroid games list, you kinda know my general thoughts on this game. But if you're new here, please hear me out. Metroid is one of my favorite video game franchises ever made, with Super Metroid probably being my favorite SNES game and second favorite video game of all time. Yeah, I know it used to be A Link to the Past, but I feel that strongly about Super Metroid now than I did back then. Although A Link to the Past is still my favorite Zelda game, and my second favorite Super Nintendo game, but that's besides the point. In addition to Super, I adore Metroid Fusion and Zero Mission. I love the 3D Metroids like Metroid Prime 1 and especially 2. Metroid Prime 3 and Metroid 2 are also quite a fun time for what they're worth, but the original Metroid is kind of a tough pill to swallow. It was the very first Metroid game I ever played, and while it did have a pretty strong beginning, I was initially bored with it after being stuck in the yellow shaft area for 2 hours. It wasn't until years later where I played through it and beat it, eventually getting some outside assistance not even halfway through the playthrough. And the more I replayed the game, the more familiar I became with the layout. And while every playthrough since the second one got a little better, 5 playthroughs in and I can simply say, I don't get it. It's kind of a hard thing to admit because Metroid is often on top of the best NES games list everywhere on the internet, and while I won't deny there's something here that people absolutely love about this game, I recognize what they love about it, but even then, I still don't get it. I don't get the levels of stimuli or joy they get when traversing through the creepy alien world of Zebes, an organic fortress guarded only by indigenous lifeforms and a few space pirates here and there. It's kind of frustrating because it sounds exactly like the kind of game I would be into, given how I'm kind of a sci-fi geek, but to illustrate why I feel the way I do, it's because I'm a freaking millennial who just wants my hand held by boring tutorials and straight line level design. Wait, no, that's not it. But this is not going to be one of those smarmy, people only like this game for nostalgia kind of anecdotes. Believe me, I hate when some gamers do that to others. They don't even hear them out, they just assume it's only because they grew up with it. So the purpose of this video is not asking you, the audience, is your classic really that good? Because that would be condescending. This is more of a video asking myself, why am I not a fan of this game? There's gotta be a reason for it. Given how this game came out in 1987 in North America, this game was following up critically acclaimed hits such as Super Mario Bros. And The Legend of Zelda. Developed by the folks at Nintendo R&D 1 with some of the coding assisted by Intelligent Systems, Metroid was a project made out of pure ambition, whether it be the inspiration from Ridley Scott's Alien film, or the non-linear form of progression present in The Legend of Zelda. And under the direction of Satoru Okada and Yoshio Sakamoto, with it being produced by Gunpei Yokoi, creator of the Game & Watch handheld, Metroid from the start was in very good hands. This team wanted to sell this game as its own unique title in a populated NES market. At the time, the idea of making a game with shooting elements was pretty commonplace, but what wasn't commonplace was incorporating sci-fi shooting elements in a non-linear adventure game, which would go on to become the series standard and create its own subgenre called Metroidvania. A game with shooting, platforming, exploring, and upgrading hasn't been done in this manner before, and it comes as no surprise that this game was a massive hit, selling 2.7 million copies worldwide, and it seems to have won the hearts of the NES buffs. So it's clear from the start they wanted to make Metroid a game many NES kids could spend hours on and just enjoy themselves, exploring this little digital world that wasn't possible before. But sometimes, an innovative game can also be a product of its time. The game starts out with a very creepy chiptune with a barren landscape illuminated by the starry sky. It already establishes this planet as otherworldly and unlike anything seen before. Wait a few seconds and we get a very English story of why we are here. Defeat the Metroid of the planet Zebeth and destroy the mother brain, the mechanical vein. What? Not sure why they added mechanical vein. That makes no sense. Anyways, since that was too brief, let's have the story further elaborated in the manual. And it's downloaded. I just love the legally ambiguous part of the internet. The manual story mentioned how in the year of 2000, the Galactic Federation was formed, and with this new federation established, there came interstellar trade between species and worlds. But with this also came space pirates that looted these spacecrafts, and because they're heavily armed and space is very massive, these pirates have gone uncontested. So the Federation recruit the toughest warriors known as space hunters, and decades later, a research spaceship was attacked by the space pirates, stealing the dangerous creature known as the Metroid, and if exposed to beta rays, they can multiply. The space pirates steal these in hopes of weaponizing them against the Federation, which poses a galactic scale threat. So space hunter Samus Aran is tasked with not only infiltrating the space pirate fortress on planet Zebes, it's spelled differently here, but also to destroy the Metroids and the Mother Brain. Why couldn't the Federation do it themselves? Well, they tried, but they also failed on their attack of the natural fortress. Also, I still find it funny that the manual refers to Samus with male pronouns, even though... SideQuest Gamer. By the laws of the internet, you must not spoil the ending to Metroid, even though it's a 30-year-old game and everyone and their grandmother knows the ending to it. You must not spoil it. You're right. That would ruin the chronological review format. We wouldn't want that now. And finally, the game begins with Samus integrating into these blue caverns with some ancient-looking architecture. This is the natural fortress of planet Zebes, but oddly, what we later know as the space pirates don't really appear in this fortress. It's guarded mostly by indigenous life forms like the Zoomers and the Screes. The Zoomers being your basic crawling enemy, and the Scree being a more kamikaze type of enemy. The game gives you these two different types of enemies early on, so you become acquainted with Samus's arm cannon, preparing you for the many more to come. And for an NES game, it does a pretty good job at a laissez-faire approach to teaching the player how to play this game. Sure, games like Zelda 1 have you start right in front of a black square that's enticing you to go into it and acquire your sword, but Zelda 1 also allows you to ignore it completely and go out into the wild unarmed. Metroid doesn't do this approach to preparing the player, and honestly, for the better, because there comes a point where a few screens to the right, there's an area you can't quite crawl into, but rather than Google, "Can Metroid crawl?" you could also retrace your steps to the beginning, jumping to the left, and now you have the Marumari ability, where Samus can roll into a ball and into those spaces you thought you could crawl into. And you know you acquired something special thanks to the sound designers giving these special items a little jingle, communicating to the player that it's an item unlike any other. And after that, the game sets you out into the wild, and you're free to roam around to wherever you please, given you have the abilities to do so. That was where I quit the game, as ashamed as I was to admit that, but hey, I was a kid, I had things to do. To be fair, I was much younger, I didn't have the patience as I just want to get to Super Metroid that bad, but I wouldn't allow myself to play Super until I finished Metroids 1 and 2. Eventually finding the first set of missiles wasn't too difficult, but as someone who just wanted to go to Norfair, having no knowledge of there being bombs necessary to propel Samus into one of those crevices was just as annoying back then. It was way too many rooms to explore on a school night. And in retrospect, once you do find the bombs and missiles, they really aren't that well hidden. For one, these rooms just had nothing but bleeping and ambience as well as enemies, auditorily indicating that there's something here, something behind that door that can only be destroyed by missiles. And this was the first sign that I needed something else, a new ability to get through this red door, because my normal laser wouldn't cut it, and within an hour I eventually found not only the bombs but also the laser extension, making my laser cannon able to shoot in longer distances. And with the power bombs and lovely collection of missiles in my possession, I was ready to explore the world of Zebes beyond the 3 colored shafts. When it comes to nonlinear games, difficulty balancing is a tricky thing to implement. You want the next given area to increase the difficulty curve established in Brinstar, which was the area we were in before. For Kraid's Lair, this was what got my butt handed to me. This area is filled with infinitely spawning Giga enemies that have quite the high damage output. And as you can imagine, someone like me wouldn't be able to get that far thanks to these enemies, and it turns out back on Brinstar, there's this treasure known as the Varia suit, and there's 2 ways to acquire it. You can either get the high jump boots at Norfair, somehow have the intuition to shoot the ceiling of the small corridor, and just jump over to the door, and there's your higher defense Varia suit, or you can get one of 2 ice beams, shoot the blocks just before the waver flies into the newly formed opening, and if you time it just right, the blocks will reintegrate and trap the creature in the upper room, and now you just have to freeze it with the ice beam and use it as a platform. The point I really want to drive home is to illustrate how there's many options you have when it comes to progression. While you do need some missiles, the power bombs, and eventually the ice beams to progress, everything else is optional. You don't have to go through Kraid and Norfair with the Varia suit. It just makes things so much easier for new players, but if you do want to get the extra things like the Varia suit, there are many ways to gain access to it, as I mentioned. But this is where nonlinear game design can inspire debate. How hidden is too hidden? Is it the game's job to give you a subtle indicator of the existence of some of the optional items? How is anyone supposed to know where the Brinstar, Ice Beam, and the Varia suits are located? Same can be said about the location of the screw attack. It seems that the primary items are easier to find, but things you don't need are near impossible due to how samey the textures look. There's not even a slight visual indicator as to which way to go, which may result in the player just bombing every tile of every room. This is where I notice some things that bring my enjoyment level of the game down quite a bit. Not only are some of the useful items well hidden, but areas like Norfair, some of Brinstar, and especially Ridley's Lair have cryptic areas that you need to have outside knowledge of in order to progress. Like, I made it all the way down to this one corridor in Ridley's Lair, only for a metal protrusion with a small opening on top to scoff at me as I sit there watching the hoppers go about their day. Turns out, there was a floor tile that was bombable in this room, but by the time I gained this outside knowledge, I was looking for another way into that area. I'm all for exploration, but there comes a point where I wasn't playing the game with the goal the game set out to do, immerse the player so they get the maximum amount of enjoyment in this environment. I don't mind when a game built around exploration doesn't hold my hand and just leaves me to my own devices, hence why I love Morrowind so much, but how Morrowind succeeded in this idea where Metroid failed, places where you need to go look different. They all have their own identity, and NPCs give you the information you need, but not necessarily information you want. I know it's a very broad comparison, but the identical but explodable tiles bugged me in the same way the stone walls in Zelda 1 bugs me. And if this is such infallible game design, then I ask why the designers of Super Metroid and A Link to the Past mostly done away with these aspects. Because it bogs down the pace to a crawl. It feels more like player imprisonment than it is player freedom. And don't get me wrong, games should punish the player for their own foolish mistakes, but riddle me this, what exactly is this game punishing me for again? Not solving the puzzle that I had no idea ever existed? Not being among the game designers who put these tiles in? Not subscribing to Nintendo Power? The answer appears to be that the developers are trying that Zelda 1 approach where only word of mouth solves the puzzles, or trial and error. I can only imagine the exhausting frustration kids experienced back in 1987, where they're given a few hours to play the game before parents want to watch the television again, or send their kids outside, or let one of their siblings have a turn, and they have to spend their limited time just looking for that one freaking destructible tile. And that can be exhausting. Once you do know your way around Brinstar, Norfair, and the two hideouts, what's there is still problematic. You see, Brinstar's layout has the blue tutorial caverns that I praised earlier, the 3 color chests with 2 being yellow, and then these rooms are corridors with sand that drains away health and the flying enemies. Norfair and the hideouts aren't that much different, except Norfair has these bubble crevices that make traversing this rat maze more interesting at least. But these environments lack any real cohesion, which is something that's addressed as early as Metroid 2, where the caverns have split pathways and everything is either isolated but convenient, or have the Super Metroid approach to being more interconnected, like Crateria being connected to the wrecked ship, which is connected to Meridia Depths. Sometimes, I find myself going through a series of corridors to get an optional item, only to find that there's no shortcut back. So you have to backtrack where you want to go, and if the game wasn't that much fun to begin with, it sure isn't now, going through the same obstacles I've seen before. The map layout just feels a bit thoughtless, like how is it that areas like Kraid's Lair have 3 rooms with literally nothing in them, or Brinstar having a secret passage with literally nothing and a pain in the ass way back out. And I know this is just for a first time player, and it'll gradually get better when you know where all the cryptic tiles are, but believe me, there's some major gripes I have with the game that just stay with repeat playthroughs. Traversing these environments can be tiring because the controls aren't really that great. I mean, early Nintendo games adopted these control schemes because the devs were still learning and just giving the player the bare minimum to make it through. Samus's jump is a bit too floaty for my liking. Like, I don't feel like I have the optimal amount of control over Samus's jump, unlike Super Metroid where mastery of the controls could result in all sorts of crazy but satisfying movements. Even games like Metroid 2 had a better vision for Samus's moveset thanks to ducking and downwards aiming added to Samus's moveset, preventing the annoying enemies from ruining my day when falling down a shaft. But for Metroid 1, falling down a shaft sometimes has you careening into enemies you didn't see coming, and it doesn't help for horizontal sections that knockback can be a cruel mistress, especially in a pit stuck between two columns. The controls are not bad, but in comparison to Super Metroid and especially Fusion, they just feel like they hit that gray area where it's not good either. And even then, that's still part of the long equation that amounts to my indifference with the game overall. But we're almost near the end. To access Torian through that statue room in Brinstar, we have to kill the two creatures identical to those statues. And these are Ridley and Kraid, the high-ranking members of the Space Pirates, and seems to be the only Space Pirates here. Ridley is pathetic since a lot of his flame attacks are an avoidable arc. I know they're harder in the Japanese version, but I'm a North American playing the North American version. All I had to do was just spam him with missiles and he dies really quickly, kind of why I tend to take on Ridley first before I go to Kraid. Kraid is probably the best boss in the game, and even then he kind of sucks. He shoots spikes out of his stomach and you can get your missiles to hit him when his stomach isn't growing new spikes. The trick is to freeze these existing spikes in midair so he can't deploy anymore until those unfreeze, but what makes him suck is how he can easily take him out with the power bombs. So it's either do that in the intended way, which takes too long, or the cheap way, which makes it too short. There's no middle ground. I know these are the first bosses in the first entry of the Metroid series, and the series will gradually get better with boss design, but that just further emphasizes how basic these boss battles are, and that's not even the last boss. With Ridley and Kraid defeated, we finally move on to Torian by shooting the statues, and a bridge forming an access way to the elevator. Now with the main character being called Samus, what exactly is the titular Metroid, which Nintendo named as an amalgamation of Metro and Android? Oh jeez, this game just turned into a survival horror game. Very appropriate for the month of October. If you enter this area with anything but the ice beam, then you're so screwed because you need to freeze them in midair and murder them with missiles. Otherwise, they'll stick onto you, leeching away your HP, and good luck getting rid of them. And it gets even worse with these laser spaghettios joining in. Even if you get past the Metroids, you do not want to get a game over at this point because of the annoying boss fight against Mother Freaking Brain. First, you have to destroy these blockages that connect to her life support system while avoiding these Rinka enemies that are trying to bombard Samus, and then pound missiles into Mother Brain. But again, these Rinkas are so annoying, constantly causing knockback damage, sometimes into the acid pit, and it's hard to get out. I know the trick is to freeze them, but this boss fight shows how inconvenient the control scheme can be at times. Getting a game over here as well as anywhere in this game is so rage quit worthy, because whether you continue or use the password, you'll always start out with just 30 HP regardless of how many E-tanks you collected. And it sucks even more if you're playing this game on original hardware, and because the zeros and O's look very similar in the password screen, you could accidentally write down the wrong password and have to restart the game or use a password from an earlier point. I know this game can be short, but that's no excuse. The Japanese version at least had a save system solving one of these two problems. Sure, save batteries would up the price of the Metroid cartridges, but if Zelda 1 could do it with no problems and still be a critical and commercial hit, so could Metroid. It was going to sell millions of copies regardless. And there's a third problem with just starting out with 30 HP. Having to grind for health at these gigavats is tedious because even getting half of the full health can take up to 5 minutes. 5 minutes of repetitive farming, which feels a lot longer than it actually is. Yes, some enemies do drop 20 HP, but these Giga enemies only drop 5 if it's not missiles, or worse, absolutely nothing, which can happen a lot. It gets really boring, really fast, further bogging down the pace of the game. It's so boring!
How does that work? Where does that expression come from? Doesn't make any sense.
Make it stop!
It doesn't make sense. Life doesn't make sense. You know, look at me. You're a fierce warrior. Must be very lucky guy.
But finally, I beat Mother Brain. Just watching her dissolve into nothingness and a countdown initiates. What? Oh, great. Samus has to climb one last vertical shaft to the surface, and with the Metroids killed and Mother Brain destroyed, we're treated to one of several endings based on how much time it took to beat the game. And the text is still in broken English. You revive peace in space, but it may be invaded by the other Metroid. Singular, not plural. Of course, you gotta have one loose end for a potential sequel that won't be for several years. Pray for a true peace in space. Okay, English localization really was something back in the day, and because I beat the game in around 3 hours, I got the fair ending where Samus removes her helmet to reveal to the world that she is a woman, and if you do better, you'll get more of her skin revealed, and not to sound like a man whose wife cheats on him, it's kind of an underwhelming and shallow ending for speedrunners. Like, what's the point? Well, unless you're some sexual deviant that gets aroused by pixelated women in bikinis. You do you if that's the case. Just don't go bragging about that. The ending to this day is still talked about because Samus Aran, while not the first female protagonist in a video game, was one of the most significant, especially out in the West, and to this day one of the more celebrated examples. I kind of take it for granted today because I didn't grow up with an NES. Before I even played a Metroid game, all of my gaming friends would talk about Super Smash Bros. On how they main Samus, and I would ask them, who's Samus again? And they're like, oh, she's a bounty hunter from the Metroid series, and I'm like, oh. But I can only imagine it shocking some players back in the 1980s, not only due to a lack of female protagonists in video games back then. I mean, there was Ms. Pac-Man, that's one. But Samus for a first-time player integrated into Brinstar as someone or something in a robotic-looking suit. The player's relationship with this pixelated being was that they were an awesome cyborg. Heck, for those who got the worst endings on their initial playthrough, it didn't reveal anything and was still that cyborg character they were playing as, continuing this aura of mystery. Is it a humanoid in that suit, an alien, or a machine? And for the better ending to reveal not only a human being behind that suit, but also a woman, might have come across as a surprise to some people. This was a world without internet spoilers, and those reading the manual's incorrect representation might have been in for an even bigger surprise than those who rented this game without the manual. One of the developers suggested the plot twist be this because it would have been cool, and as a result, there's many ways to feel about this ending. So that's Metroid, and honestly, it kind of surprised me. I thought I would just not like it at all, but I can speedrun this game comfortably and beat it under 3 hours, so Metroid for the NES is not my cup of tea.
You listen here, Sonny. Back in my day when I was a young whippersnapper, the controls were perfect and didn't need to be improved upon.
Oh, God forbid I use my own subjective parameters as to what makes fun controls. I'm so sorry I insulted your favorite piece of data. I'm sorry I insulted your favorite electronic toy. Please, by all means, burn my tongue with a hot spoon.
You asked for it, Sonny. Ha!
The graphics were pretty good for the time, and I do like some of the designs like the Norfer Cyclopean demon statues and the area being comprised of bubbles, but the black background can be a bit boring to look at for the entire playthrough, and the music composed by Hirokazu Tanaka is honestly this game's greatest aspect that held up the best, from the creepy slow melody of the intro theme to atmospheric pieces like Ridley's Hideout, just setting up the fact that you're in the treacherous lair of the space dragon. And can I just say, I love Kraid's lair theme so much. That piece is a faster melody with an aura of mystery seamlessly transitioned from one part to the next, but each part of the song just builds up to the next and it's so darn catchy as a result. If I had to make a top 10 best 8-bit chiptunes, this might make it on the list. Tanaka really outdid himself, and it's cool to see as early as this game, good atmospheric music is the series standard. There's a fantastic game in there buried underneath all the design issues I had a problem with. So overall, I find this game mediocre. Most people would say that the lack of a map ruins the game. Maybe for some people, but I'm not filthy casual. I'm just kidding. I'd argue that you don't really need a map as long as there's good landmarks here and there, and for me at least, getting lost isn't that much of an issue 5 playthroughs in. But for the other aspects, this game to me hasn't aged that well, and for that reason alone, it's hard to recommend this game to everyone. You have to have a very specific set of subjective parameters to get the most out of this. And when it comes to other NES games like Balloon Fight and Clue Clue Land, which have hardly aged at all because their simplicity gave them so much charm, and not to mention they're a lot of fun. Metroid 1 feels more like the prototype of an idea rather than a complete one, something they can just build upon and will build upon. So for being the start of something that eventually becomes one of my favorite game series of all time, I respect Metroid 1 for what it did, even if I don't celebrate the name as one of the greatest games of all time. Is this game groundbreaking? You bet your Various suit it is. But just because something is groundbreaking doesn't necessarily mean it'll be for everyone, and it's just not for me.
And you know what? That's alright. I don't have to love every game out there that's considered a classic. Heck, some of my favorite games are probably ones you can't get into. For those who love this game, I'm glad you can have more fun with it than I can. And to anyone watching, let me know your thoughts on Metroid, whether you agree or disagree. But until then, we're not exactly quite done with this game. I mean, we're done with this version of the game, but not necessarily all versions. So next time, join me as I take a look at the Metroid Mother ROM hack. Does it improve the experience? Let's find out. But until then, thank you all so much for watching, and remember to stay awesome.
Psych, Gamer, what about the no power suit Samus mode?
You mean the Justin Bailey code?
Well, you could put in the Justin Bailey code, but back in my day when I was a young whippersnapper, we actually beat the game in under 3 hours.
Alright, let's test it out.
Suitless Samus mode just has Samus appear without her power suit, and you can play the entire game like this. Thing is though, you have to beat this game in under 3 hours, and I honestly don't care enough about this game to play through it a second time. If you beat the game in under 3 hours, there's your reward, but to be honest, I'd say don't even bother. Just beat the game normally and call it a day.
Happy Halloween, everyone! Oh, okay, that was pretty cliche. Hello?